it's one of the best articles I think I've ever read by someone covering the Gamecocks as far as a deep dive into history and talking about something significant and tying it to, I guess, the Gigi Jackson thing now, the Mike Grosso story. I'm old enough to remember my dad and mom talking about Carolina leaving the ACC, and there are a lot of political things involved. And I knew the story, but that article that was, by the way, you guys can read it on the Charleston Post and Courier, was outstanding. And that was really laid the groundwork, I think, for where we're at now with the Gamecocks leaving the Atlantic Coast Conference in the early 70s and going through the wilderness for 20 years, and now they're in the SEC. But kind of walk us through that story and sort of, just tell the story about what happened and all that for those that may not know.
Yeah, and I appreciate the compliment, JC. I've been working on it for about a month and a half. I thank my editor, Jeff Hartzell, so much because we were originally planning to run it in September. And I was like, man, this is going to be a pretty lengthy story. You think we should split it up? And he's like, honestly, man, why don't we do it, in October at the bye week? We'll have more room in the paper. And I thought, that's brilliant because that's when basketball practice starts. So thank him for making that decision. It really turned it out well and gave me more time to work on it. But anyway, for those of you who don't know, Mike Grosso was one of the best basketball recruits in the country in the class of 1965. Exact recruiting rankings aren't really, known from back then. They had the parade All-American team or what have you, but they didn't have a ranking service. But most people confirmed that there was one number one recruit, a guy named Lou Alcindor, who some of you may have heard of, and then there was Mike Grosso. And Mike wanted to come play here. He wanted to play for Frank McGuire, so he did. Of course, back then, freshmen couldn't play varsity ball, so he wasn't going to play in the 1965-66 season anyway. Well, he was coming in. South Carolina was in the ACC in its first couple of years under Frank McGuire. McGuire had obviously been in the ACC before at North Carolina, won a national championship in 1957. There was a lot of bad blood between Frank and the rest of the ACC for how he won. He was kicked out at North Carolina for some recruiting violations. A lot of other folks didn't like that. And then when he came back, they probably thought he's going to do this again, and he might upset our apple cart. So back then there was a rule that the ACC passed before Mike Grosso ever got in school that said any student athlete to get an athletic scholarship has to score an 800 on their SAT. You got to get an 800 to get a scholarship. If you don't get an 800, you can't get a scholarship, but you can still play football or basketball. Mike Grosso didn't get an 800, so, okay, no big deal. He paid his own way to school, and he was here as a freshman, couldn't play varsity anyway, no big deal. But then the ACC in the middle of that freshman year said, we're going to change that rule. Now, if you are in school and you haven't got an 800 on your SAT, you can't get a scholarship and you can't play. In the middle of the freshman year. So naturally, McGuire and Grosso are like, what? You can't just change stuff midstream. And they said, well, actually, we can. We're the ACC. They appealed. Of course, they weren't going to win. As another story has told it, Sports Illustrated back in the 60s wrote it, Frank McGuire had to be physically restrained from going after the guys that did it. And pretty much it was Mike Grosso was not allowed to play here. Now, what's weird about JC is that, as I mentioned in the story, they were playing scrimmages before that 66-67 season ever started. Mike tore his knee up. He got undercut by a kid when they were playing Guilford College at the Old Carolina Fieldhouse, and he was done for the year. He wouldn't have been able to play anyway. The ACC knew that when they took up the appeal, and yet they still didn't give him any grandfathering, didn't give him any, okay, we'll look at it next year when you're better. They just said, nope, you're done, bye. So he had to leave, and he went to Louisville and recovered and averaged a double-double for the rest of his 2 years, briefly played in the pros, but he never got to play at South Carolina. And that right there was the impetus, the first spark on the bonfire that said USC has got to leave the ACC if they're going to not treat them fairly. As you guys know, it took another 5 years. They won the ACC basketball tournament in 1971, and soon after that they said, we're leaving. And what was the reason given? We need to have better academic restrictions. We want to be, coincidentally, like the Southeastern Conference that has an admission score of 50 points lower on your SAT. but it was too late to help Mike Grosso. And how I got turned on to it, you've been around for a long time. And like you, JC, I'd heard the stories, and I was like, everything I did research, I was like, has anybody ever actually talked to this guy? And I couldn't find it. And I said, well, yeah, I'll take a shot in the dark. I mean, you can talk to his teammates, but it's going to be a better story if you get him. So I tracked him down, called him, and it took some doing. He's like, man, a long time ago, and he was going through some medical stuff at the time. He lost his wife, unfortunately, 3 years ago. But we kept talking. He was like, yeah, okay, let's talk. And I just said, unfiltered, man, tell me what you think. And obviously I had to filter a little bit of it for the paper because there are some very bitter feelings left over from that. But as Mike said, had it not happened the way it did, I never would have met my wife, and I never would have had the wonderful years I had with her. So he worked out for the best. But as for his teammates, they're like, you have no idea how good this guy was.